The first Bootstrap topic we're going to discuss is how it's able to make pages responsive to different size viewports. And the key to how it does this is through something called the grid system. The grid system essentially breaks web pages up as both rows and columns. Rows are the easier portion of this because they simply span the whole width of the viewport. Columns are a little bit trickier because we need to be intelligent about how many columns we break our web page up into. And we want to break it up into a number that has a lot of factors. This is because having a lot of factors will make it easier for us to make our page balanced and even in terms of our content and how we display things on the page. Now in the next lesson, we're actually going to learn about the specific classes Bootstrap offers us as part of its grid system in order to be able to do this. But in this lesson, we want to build a solid foundation and intuition for this grid system by kind of doing it ourselves from scratch. We're not going to fully replicate Bootstrap's grid system, but we're going to do enough to be able to understand what is going on under the hood with Bootstrap. Let's begin in our index.html file, and I'm going to start by adding 12 div elements. Why 12 div elements, you might be wondering? Well, remember, we discussed we want to break up our rows into a number of columns that has a large number of factors so we can evenly balance the content on our page. And 12 has quite a few number of factors. It's divisible by 12 and 1, of course. It's also divisible by 6 and 2, as well as 3 and 4. This means we can easily break up our page into a whole, a half, a third, or a quarter without having so many columns that it becomes cumbersome. And we also added classes to each of these div elements. Each one contains the class call, and then we go in order from call-1 up to call-12. Let's go into our style.css to see what the purpose of each of these classes is. And the first thing I'm going to do is add some style rules to our body element that makes its width 100% and its margin 0 pixels. And this way our body is going to span the entire width of the page without any border between it and the edge of our browser. Then I'm going to add some style rules to our call class. And the rules that I'm going to add are a border that's 1 pixel solid and black and a background color that's kind of a light gray. And finally, I'm going to style the widths of each of our numbered columns, and you'll notice that the widths are proportional to the number of the column divided by 12. So our .call-1 style rule sets the width to 8.33%, and this is because 1 divided by 12 is 8.33%, and similarly 2 divided by 12 is 1/6, so 16.66%, and so on and so forth. And so what happens is that now we have classes which change the widths of our block elements, in this case our div elements that we have in our index.html page, to span only a portion of the full width of the row that they take up. And in effect, what we've done is create columns. And we can see the effect this has when we refresh our browser. We have different size div elements based on the column class that we assign to that div. So a call-1 class only takes up 1 column, whereas, for instance, a call-12 class takes up the entire row. The last thing we want to do is take a look at how this grid system approach can actually make our web page responsive to different size viewports. And I'm going to do a couple things to illustrate this point. The first thing I'm going to do is add another rule that selects each of these classes, each of these column-number classes, and set the width to 100%. Then I'm going to stick each of these individual rules inside of what's called a media query. And in this case, our media query is going to ask, is the width of our viewport at least 992 pixels wide? And if it is, then it's going to apply all of these individual styling rules. So what's happening here is we're giving a default behavior to all of our column-number classes to be the full width of the viewport, meaning to take up the full row of the grid. However, if the width of our viewport is at least 992 pixels wide, then it's going to differentiate each of these classes' widths according to the number of columns they take up. Let's go to our browser to see this behavior in action. We'll refresh it, and we'll notice that it looks like nothing changed. And that's because the width of our viewport, meaning the width of our browser, is at least 992 pixels wide. But watch what happens when we shrink the width of our browser. Eventually we shrink it enough to where now it's less than 992 pixels and all of our columns take up the full row of our grid. And so this is actually the key of Bootstrap mobile responsivity, is that it changes the width of columns depending on the size of the viewport.